Hello audience, Mr. Z here. The Civil War needs little introduction. Most of you already know the general build-up which led to the outbreak of the conflict. The growing divide between northern and southern life, dominance of pro-northern policy, the Missouri Compromise, bloody Kansas, slave uprisings, and finally the secession of the southern states. The northern states had a history steeped in trade thanks to the fruitful ports of New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, while the greater development of northern cities allowed for urbanization and growth of industries, which could very easily export their goods to Europe, thus generating much wealth for the region, and making the North the more dominant financial, political, and cultural force within the nation, not to mention the more populous of the two, as the northern population more than doubled that of the South, perhaps even more if the slave population isn't taken into account. The South had become fairly distinct from the North in its policy, culture, and economics. Southern lands were less developed, lacked industry, and as you could imagine, were more rural as opposed to the urban North. It is because of this rural environment that the South relied upon agriculture, most famously, cotton. Agriculture was where the South shined and excelled. It was the cornerstone of the Southern economy and Southern way of life, and while slavery wasn't necessary for such a system to succeed, it became a facet most Southerners had become dependent on, unfortunately intertwining it into the Southern way of life, which made it difficult to remove. Northerners grossly had far less use for slave labor, and thus many northern states began to outlaw the practice entirely. And because the North held dominance over the nation, policies throughout the 1800s would come to favor northern lifestyles, and of course economics. Because individual states had greater autonomy in those days, this rarely affected the southern states unless the changes came at the federal level, because sometimes the North would tell the South to play ball with a policy it liked, but that policy would just be incompatible with Southern policy. The North would need to back off most of the time, but there came the issue of manifest destiny, westward expansion. Of course the South would expect to gain some more farmland in the deal, but the North was determined to halt slavery where it stands, refusing to allow more slave states into the Union, which caused more problems because that was kind of the South's formula. This would initiate decades of disputes and small-scale violence, leading many Southerners to feel as though they'd become second-class citizens of the federal government, all this finally culminating in the secession of the southern states. But what if things were different for the South? What if, in an alternate timeline, things didn't just go well for the South, but things went great for the South? What if the world saw a southern United States which became the economic and cultural heart of the US, so much so that the North seceded from the South? Before we get into today's video, I'd like to mention our sponsor, NordVPN. Why am I sponsoring NordVPN? Well, because some of my videos are unviewable in the UK, parts of the EU, and China. So if you'd like to see what videos of mine your country is hiding from you, go on over and check out a trial of NordVPN free for 1 month. If you don't like it, you can get rid of it. Every one of you that does helps earn the channel a little extra dough, and hey, if I have to sponsor something, at least it's something that's helping get my content out there. Now, back to the video. Firstly, how do we go about making the South this successful? Well, we could very well go so far back to the establishment of the initial colonies and suggest greater investment be put into the South, but that muddies the future of the revolution and causes countless other butterflies that could justify a number of other scenarios. So instead, we'll suggest only one major difference. The US annexed Cuba and Puerto Rico from Spain following the War of 1812. It might seem trivial and unlikely, but not as you might think. In the early 1800s, Spain had become a proxy state of Napoleon's French Empire, weakening the nation's grip over its American colonies, whom Britain restricted Spanish access to, allowing them to grow more independent. The restoration of Bourbon rule only functioned to further destabilize the power of the empire, initiating an era of centuries-long decline. Of Spain's colonies in the Americas, only Puerto Rico and Cuba remained, which the US would later annex following the Spanish-American War. In this timeline, we're simply going to speed that up through the use of the Monroe Doctrine and good old Andrew Jackson. In our timeline, Monroe had ordered Jackson to terminate the conflicts of the First Seminole War, a war against hostile raiding parties made up of natives, escaped slaves, Spanish forces, and even British agents, concentrated along the North Floridian border. Jackson had responded to Monroe's request to cease conflicts with the statement that he would terminate the conflict by capturing Florida within 60 days and eradicating the threat the Seminole posed to the American people. This had led to a deep controversy over whether or not Jackson had violated Monroe's orders and acted against the Constitution, as this invasion could have justified the beginnings of a war against Spain. We'll propose that in this timeline, it does. Following General Jackson's campaign through Florida, a declaration of war would be announced. President Monroe ordering Jackson to lead an invasion of Spanish Cuba to liberate the island from imperial rule and to drive European affairs out of the Americas. The island too sought to separate itself from Spain, many even considering union with the US as early as Jefferson's presidency, and so would much of the population support Jackson's campaign against Spain. You see, Cuba was both a trade hub and an agricultural economy. Its cash crops were tobacco and sugarcane, two products in high demand, though sugar in particular, which required quite a bit more labor to harvest, slave labor as it turned out, and Cuba was not very fond of Spain's attempts to terminate the use of slavery, as it would cripple their economic system which had become so dependent on the practice because of Spain's monopoly over trade in the Caribbean. But if Cuba could unite with the US, that product could be traded to greater quantity and generate more revenue than ever imaginable. Puerto Rico under Napoleonic rule was a miniaturized example of this model, and rightfully earned the small island its name as a rich port. However, that immediately disappeared when Bourbon rule was restored. Thus, in this timeline, we see the First Seminole War evolve into an early Spanish-American War. Spain being battle-worn from the Napoleonic Wars and having lost the vast resources of its colonies would be nowhere near capable of fending off the reinvigorated American war machine in the era of good feelings, and thus would lose both Cuba and Puerto Rico, both of which would see, in addition to their present population, a boom of settlers from the Americas seeing the opportunity in the fields of sugar and port development, encouraging further development of Florida to allow easy access to the US's new holdings in the Caribbean. Now, how would this change things for the South exactly? Well, what we're introducing to the national dynamic is the opportunity to dominate the Caribbean, a trade paradise for the British, Dutch, Portuguese, and more, one with ports already established by Spain which could easily be developed into great centers of wealth and lands which shared a similar living style to that of the southern states. This value of the Caribbean was no mystery to the American government and was part of the reason Louisiana and Florida were such hot-ticket items to acquire. Thus, it is very likely that the acquisition of the lands of the Caribbean would drive far more migration southward than had been seen in our timeline, with only the capture of Florida. Fisheries sprout up along the Cuban and Puerto Rican coast to sell exotic catches back to Europe, while expansion westward sparks the inception of cattle ranching for the South, opening up yet another avenue of wealth. Fast forward 3 decades and southern agricultural life is now paired with a rich trade economy, bolstered by high-demand cash crops, boosting the financial influence of southern institutions and politicians despite a smaller population. Southern states seeking to stimulate their population and economy gradually replace African slave labor with low-wage white employees and would offer up land for development by northern citizens at low costs, seeing this as the only way to compete with the bustling cities of the north. By 1840, Southern influence over governmental policy would have come to dominate the nation, with Jackson's Democratic Party being the face of Southern identity, embodying agricultural economic policy, state-focused rural-style government, and an America over all else policy. Jackson changing the Monroe Doctrine over time to fit an America on the rise, certain to dominate the continent by the end of the century. In contrast to the Democrats, the North would see the increasing radicalization of the Whig Party, which, unlike the Jacksonian Democrats who favored sovereignty of the people, the Whigs believed in strong federal government, order through law, and protection of minority interests, this party later evolving into the Republican Party we'd recognize under Lincoln. Opportunity for the South would arise once again as tensions heated up between the US and Mexico for having annexed the Republic of Texas into the Union. The area would have borne an overwhelming American population of cattle ranchers, and the annexation seemed a natural step. However, just as in our timeline, this would initiate the conflict which led to the Mexican-American War, a conflict which of course would favor the US and bring Mexico to the negotiation table. With the greater dominance of Democrats in government, a proposal which was simply tossed aside in our timeline takes on new life in this timeline. That policy would be the All of Mexico idea. A plan to, just as it sounds, annex all of Mexico. The Democrats had recognized that since Mexico still grossly practiced slavery, that they could break the region up into 25 new slave states, drastically shifting the balance of power near entirely to the slave states instead of the free states. There was much criticism and controversy over this measure, as you could imagine, most notably the matter that such an action would impose upon Mexican citizens American governance and grant citizenship to millions of Mexicans. The Democrats would be able to cite that there is now precedence thanks to the annexation of Cuba and Puerto Rico, which had granted citizenship to a number of then foreign Cubans and Puerto Ricans. James K. Polk would come to a compromise over the dispute, proposing the simple annexation of the eastern Mexican coast up to the Yucatan Peninsula, as well as Baja California, in addition to the territories we'd receive in our timeline, welcoming 5 new slave states into the Union in addition to Texas, and a number of territories the South would certainly have its eyes on. This compromise would still anger the North, as it would just further shift the center of power southward, even if only gradually. By the election of 1848, the northern states of New England, New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey would have formed a solid voting bloc in favor of the Whigs, while nearly the rest of the nation came to vote Democrat for candidate Lewis Cass. Lewis Cass would win the presidency on a platform of popular sovereignty, holding that the populations of each state hold a referendum over if or not they should continue or permit slavery. As typical, the northern states would remain steadfast in their ambition to abolish slavery across the board, but states like Maryland, Delaware, Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois would be flipped to support Cass, many believing this policy would finally end the North-South division, but as the referendum returned, so would division widen between the abolitionist Northeast and the South, as Maryland and Ohio's votes returned for slavery, separating the hardline free states of the Northeast from the less radical free states of the West. Cass's presidency would be marked by this referendum, as well as the further development and purchase of new American lands in Mexico, further solidifying the strength of the South and Democratic Party in the United States, as the election of 1856 geared up with Southern Democratic candidate John C. Breckinridge in place of the more moderate Buchanan, who attempted to appeal to both Democrats of the South and Republicans of the North. Breckinridge was far more of a hardliner than Buchanan, and was to the North what Lincoln was to the South. Interestingly enough, the two happened to be related through marriage, Mary Todd Lincoln, Abraham's wife, being Breckinridge's cousin. Breckinridge would be a strong proponent for Southern policy, yet had Northern concerns in mind and attempted to resolve them through enacting nationwide voluntary emancipation, which allowed owners to free their slaves if they so wished, and would further fund and promote the colonization societies of Virginia, Maryland, Kentucky, Tennessee, and the Carolinas, organizations within the individual states which sought to gradually relocate freed slaves to Liberia. However, Breckinridge's actions would not be enough to appease the abolitionist North, eventually leading to the issuing of a Declaration of Secession that same year, signed by members of the Republican Party, now headed by explorer, veteran, and anti-slave activist John C. Fremont, or Fremont as some might say it. Breckinridge was a believer in the right of secession, but also expressed his devotion to the unity of the nation, and would certainly attempt to reintroduce the North back into the Union, but it is very unlikely that he would resort to war to reintroduce them. The U.S. by this point had shifted its heart of commerce to areas like Maryland, Virginia, and the Caribbean. The North certainly held a concentration of industry, but the industries of states like Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana would remain within the Union, not to mention any urbanization which may have developed along the Golden Circle of the Mexican Gulf. The North, which would rebrand itself New England, is able to exist sustainably, though is heavily dependent upon overseas trade to retain the same prosperity it had seen as part of the larger national unit, leading it to build better relations with Britain and Canada just north of its border. The South, which we'll refer to as Dixie, would develop an alliance with the Second French Empire to bring the remainder of Mexico and Central America under French rule, in exchange for an exclusive trade partnership, supporting the French invasion and conquest of Mexico and installing Maximilian I. Slavery in the United States was on the trajectory toward being eradicated through one means or another. While the states of Virginia, Maryland, Ohio, and Kentucky were legally slave states and allowed the practice, few within these states actually partook in it, and by this point the early actions of the South to replace slave labor with low-wage labor had proven more stimulating to the economies and allowed for a balance of agriculture and industry in these regions. The deeper south you went, the more prevalent the actual use of slaves would become, but it was a system slowly on its way out. Thanks to individual sovereignty, the identity of each state within Dixie becomes more distinct and specialized, while still holding true to the core American virtues. It would become common practice for no state to impose its will upon another state within the Union, but as far as outside parties went, they were free game. New England remained staunchly opposed to Dixie's gradual process of slave abolition, recognizing that many would still need to continue enduring the treatment of slavery until it was finally done away with. However, being separated from Dixie, New England simply continues to distance itself politically and economically, many of its citizens encouraging escaped slaves to flee north or simply to rebel, actions which were not greatly appreciated by Dixie, leading to minor hostilities between the two. Liberia would likely benefit most from this process, as millions of freed slaves would now add to the nation's numbers and fill positions which remained unoccupied in our timeline, and ultimately left the nation in an underpopulated mess. The Golden Circle, as the Caribbean would become known, would form a massive revenue stream for Dixie, as it became a Silk Road of sorts for British, French, South American, and Dutch traders, As a side effect, this region would also become steeped in corruption, crime, and piracy, eventually coming to dominate the major ports and harvesting companies. Mexico under Maximilian and French rule would face a similar trial to the US, establishing core cities and states occupied by Spaniards and Creole descendants, however needing to consistently fend off attacks by hostile native populations which refused to integrate or submit to foreign rule. Finally, war between the North and South may be ignited with the onset of World War I. New England possibly going too far by instigating a revolt among slaves in the Golden Circle, however unwittingly escalating it to the level of a revolution. This would lead Dixie to invade New England in retaliation, and draw the nations into opposite sides of the Great War. Dixie, with its superior capabilities, could launch a brutal campaign against New England, who by this point in time would be far outmatched by the South in every way. British allegiance to New England would open the door for a push into Canada. The French Empire, which had fled into exile in Mexico following the Franco-Prussian War, may well ally with the South in order to reclaim France, meaning this overwhelming force here could join the Central Powers and most likely turn the tides of war. And that is where I'll end this video for now. The US of Z thanks for watching. Support your Legion by liking the video, or join our ranks by subscribing for more. Mr. Z, out.